Okay, as I said, you're watching LaRouche Pack Saturday Evening Class with Bob Ingram. Um, and This is Tony Pappert. I'll be your host. So let's begin. Um, in a recent, very explosive two-part article series on LaRouche Pack, and I'll show you the series in just a moment. Bob Ingram, our guest tonight, has opened the explosive question as to just what exactly is the ruling class. We've had President Trump using that expression. I don't know how long he's used it, but he's using it now. The ruling class. It's the ruling class that's trying to put him in jail to keep him from winning the presidency in 2024. And it is the ruling class. But what is it? And others are using this expression too. Some use the expression the oligarchy. Here at the moment, I'll use the ruling class. But exactly what is this ruling class, which is really pulling the strings ultimately behind the decrepit Biden, who doesn't know what he's doing, and behind his administration, which is really the Obama administration, without Obama and with Biden playing a figurehead role. But just what is that ruling class? Is it greedy corporations? Is it billionaires, whether from Silicon Valley or wherever? What is this ruling class? I just read an article, I think about 2 days old, by the business tycoon, I think retired, Andy Puzder, who raises some questions which he tries to answer but can't. The following, that Bud Light, after their ridiculous episode with attempting to make a transgender influencer, Dylan Mulvaney, the face of Bud Light beer, Bud Light has lost 15% of their market capitalization over 5 months. That is 15% of their total stock value, even while Bill Gates' family foundation invested $95 billion in the stocks of the corporation which owns Bud Light in an attempt to keep its prices up unsuccessfully. Similarly, Walt Disney has cut $7,000, 7,000 jobs. Their market capitalization, total stock value of Disney stock is down 40% since March 2022, when they voiced their opposition to a Florida parental rights bill. And they announced through various spokesmen that they were going to include woke sexual ideology in all of their forthcoming movies. And this is, I mean, of course, Disney, which had won its reputation for 2/3 of a century for family entertainment. And what Disney's selling point was that you can trust your kids to Disney. You can trust your kids to watch Disney movies. You can trust your kids at Disneyland. And now they're introducing the sexual stuff in all their movies. Don't they realize what they're doing? That the whole trademark, the whole basic, what we call raison d'etre, the whole reason for Disney's existence was being flushed down the drain by this transgender and such like campaign. Now, what is going on here? I mean, these are supposed to be rich, according to, one popular view. These are supposed to be rich, greedy corporations which sacrifice everything to make a buck for their corporations. And here they are sacrificing their corporations for what? And who's telling them to do it? And why are they doing it? Now, one of the explanations, offered for both of those cases of Bud Light and Disney is, oh, don't you see, they've hired a bunch of kids out of college. The kids out of college have woke values, and the kids out of college insisted that these multi-billion-dollar international corporations adopt the woke values of the people they hired a month ago. And the corporations were stupid enough to do it. Well, who really believes that? Who is calling the shots? What's behind this? what is the ruling class? Where does all this stuff come from? So with that, let me turn it over to Bob.
Okay, hello, folks. Excuse me. Well, there's a lot to go through here. The title of this, for those who got the email, the title of this presentation is How the Oligarchy Rules. And that's actually, that phrase, how the oligarchy rules, covers a much broader subject than we're going to be able to cover tonight, because you've got, I mean, just for instance, you've got the whole question of the central banking system. You've got the question of the offshore banking system. You have the role of companies like BlackRock, and the a financial octopus, a financial power structure, which is all part of this. And there's no way to really go into all of that in this presentation. What I'm going to be focusing on is the question of foundations, and to a lesser extent, the question of nonprofit organizations and non-governmental organizations. And, you know, as Tony said, the challenge here, and this is a challenge, which I'm essentially challenging all of you, all of the people on this call to, to confront, is that when people think about these kind of things, they tend to think about it's the rich people, it's the billionaires, it's people like Bill Gates or George Soros. It's these rich billionaire individuals, the uber wealthy, who are the problem. It's the rich versus the poor. Now, there's obviously an element of truth in that, but if that's what you believe, it's ultimately not true. It's false, because what we're dealing with is something entirely different, which people have a difficult time wrapping their minds around. And part of, well, I won't mention that, but I'm going to begin after just a few comments here by reading to you a quotation from a speech that Lyndon LaRouche delivered in 1992. And you'll hear what LaRouche has to say in just a minute. But what we're dealing with here is not just rich or wealthy individuals. We're certainly not dealing per se with what people generally think of as political ideologies. Yeah, you hear on the right all the time right now, that the people we're fighting are Marxists or communists. And, again, there's an element of truth in that, but ultimately it's not true. What we're dealing with is oligarchical financial rule. And more directly, what we're dealing with is what Lyndon LaRouche used to call the oligarchical principle. A principle upon which how society should be run, and a principle which has a certain view of human nature, of what it means to be human. And this goes back centuries. In reality, it goes back millennia. And, you could go back to ancient Babylon or some of these other societies that have existed, certainly the Roman Empire, in which there is an oligarchical view, an oligarchical principle, and oligarchical practices of how society should be run. It's anti-human. It denies the fundamental truth of what it means to be human, of what it actually means to be a human being, that all human individuals are made in God's image, that all human individuals are distinguished from the beasts through their ability to creatively reason, to make discoveries. It denies all of that. And it asserts that an elite shall rule, and that the rest of the human race are just so much cattle. They're expendable. And again, it's not just the rich versus the poor. And it goes beyond that. And I'll read you a quote which probably many people are familiar with. But it's relevant here. It's a short excerpt from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, in which he says, quote, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." And this is how you have to begin to approach this. And we'll get into that more as we go along. But the only other thing I want to just say before I read this quotation from LaRouche is that it is, in my view, critically important. And it's, scary. It can be overwhelming, but I think it's critically important that we have to confront, we have to understand where we are in history, in the history of the human species, what this moment that we are now living in actually is. This is not the 1970s or 80s. It's not even 10 or 15 years ago, 2005, 2010. You can't just debate policy, the way that we could, say in, 1985 or something. Those conditions no longer exist. We have reached a point of crisis where the view of the oligarchy is that we have reached a moment where the principles of the American Revolution, the principles which have defined the United States through ups and downs, but have endured over more than 200 years, that it is no longer tolerable that this be allowed to exist anymore, that it has to be expunged. And the same thing could be said going back further. The principles of the Renaissance, the recognition of the power of the human mind, of the creativity of the human mind, principles which go back even further, principles which are embedded in Christianity as well as in other monotheistic religions, but particularly Christianity, that these simply can no longer be allowed to exist. They have to be expunged. We are in a civilizational crisis, the likes of which have never existed before in the history of the United States. We've gone through crises like the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Depression, World War II, etc. But we have never been confronted with the type of crisis we're facing today. So with those brief introductory remarks, I'm going to read this quotation from Lyndon LaRouche. This is from a speech that he delivered to an audience in Mexico in 1992. And actually, at the time, Lyndon LaRouche was a political prisoner. He was in federal prison. And what he did was he recorded the speech over the telephone, talking to someone over the telephone. He recorded the speech from prison, and then it was played to a conference in Mexico in 1992. And in talking about the question of the oligarchical financial empire and oligarchical rule, this is what LaRouche had to say. Quote, "How is the Anglo-American empire ruled? Who are its rulers? Who are those above government who rule the Anglo-American system? Their form of government is the Fondo. The unit of government is the Fondo. The Fondo is like a financial trust or foundation, which is set up in perpetuity. It is supposedly immortal. It's not a human being. It's a trust which operates on the basis of a covenant. And this trust is presumably an immortal personality. The trust is administered by groups of people who perpetuate themselves. That is, a group of directors, of trustees who perpetuate themselves by recruiting new trustees to replace the old ones, by firing some of their members, acquiring new ones, and so forth and so on. And thus does the trust perpetuate itself biologically as well as on paper. These trusts are often associated with the names of wealthy or aristocratic families, but the families do not control the trust in the sense of being stockholders. Rather, the trust controls the families. The model of this form of trust, or fondo, is the pagan Roman law of the family, the law of paterfamilias. That is, the trust, this non-human, quasi-immortal entity, is the paterfamilias who can adopt heirs, who can disown heirs, who can have heirs killed. When we speak in North America or in England of the families, we're speaking of an aggregation of these trusts or these fondi, which can have this power. So if one were to speak of a Rockefeller, one is not speaking of a biological Rockefeller. One is speaking of of Rockefeller trusts, foundations. And similarly, all other numerous powerful families, such as Warburg or Rothschild, as well as the British royal family, which is such an entity. We're not speaking about the biological personalities, the heirs. We're speaking rather of the institution of the quasi-immortal trusts. Now, these trusts deem themselves to run the world, pretty much as the Greek pagans described the gods of Mount Olympus. These are very nasty people. Zeus was the top god. He had the most power to strike others down and do evil things. The gods as a whole were cutting each other's throats, squabbling about each other, manipulating nations, doing all kinds of nasty things. But they were deemed immortal, like the fondi, and they would meet in assembly to make sure that the arrangement under which the gods ruled the world, the trusts, and in which the ordinary people were merely virtual slaves to the gods, was perpetuated forever. That's what we mean by oligarchism. So that's the end of the quotation from Lynn. And as we proceed through this, I don't want to belabor this point, but I would ask people to reflect on what you just heard. This is not the way most people think about it. They think about evil billionaires, like, Bill Gates or someone else, or Klaus Schwab. I don't know if he's a billionaire, but the guy who runs the World Economic Forum. This is LaRouche is getting at something different here. An oligarchical force which has this bestial notion of the rest of the human species, who in their view shall rule humanity forever. And this gets to the question of the foundations today. Now, so there's a lot more I could say about that, but for time's sake, let's just move on. In one of the watershed events in modern European history, or modern American history, and really had worldwide implications, was the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913, because nothing like this had ever existed before. Now, today, the Rockefeller Foundation still exists, obviously, and it's up to no good. But it's I think it's, in terms of its capitalization, in terms of its wealth, I think it's down the list at this point. It's like 18th or 19th or 20th in terms of the largest foundations. But it was the first, and it created something entirely new. In 1910, John D. Rockefeller and his top business advisor, a man named Frederick Taylor Gates, proposed to Congress that that Congress enact legislation which would create the Rockefeller Foundation as a national foundation. And again, this would have been the first in existence. This was, it passed the House of Representatives, but it was rejected in the Senate. This is in 1910. And I want to read you a couple of quotes from what was said at that time. One senator who opposed chartering the Rockefeller Foundation said the following. He said, quote, "As far as I can see, the proposed charter would authorize all these and a multitude of similar activities. If the object of the Rockefeller Foundation is to be coextensive with human civilization, then it may do anything and everything which its trustees think likely to affect reform or improvement." So the Rockefeller Foundation's intention is to be coextensive with human civilization. Then there was another senator who basically said almost the same thing, although he supported the legislation. And he said, quote, "The board of trustees of the proposed Rockefeller Foundation is to be wholly self-perpetuating and to be authorized to do anything whatever, anywhere in the world, within the legal definition of philanthropy. It is true that such a charter would confer vast powers. It is true that no government at any time had conferred on corporations privileges so limitless. Mr. Rockefeller is mortal. The charter of the foundation will be immortal. It will be necessary to incorporate a fund which, passing from generation to generation, may do for the philanthropies of each generation so long as organized society shall exist." This senator apparently thought that was a good idea. And in his autobiography, Chapters of My Life, Rockefeller's business advisor, Frederick Taylor Greats, sort of expressed the same view. He said, quote, he wrote, "I saw no other course but for Mr. Rockefeller and his son to form a great series of philanthropies for forwarding civilization in all its elements in this land and in all lands. Philanthropies, excuse me, philanthropies, if possible, limitless in time and amount, broad in scope, and self-perpetuating." So a broad, wealthy, well-funded, organization operating outside of government, which will be limitless in time and amount, broad in scope, and self-perpetuating. Right? And those were the arguments that were made to found the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, it was rejected by the U.S. Senate in 1910, but in 1913, the Rockefeller took another stab at it, and they proposed to charter it as a state foundation, a foundation under state law in New York State. And this passed the state legislature and was signed by the governor. And this established the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913. This became the model for everything that followed. Also, that same year, 1913, in a bill that was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson called the Revenue Act of 1913, they established the creation, or the legalization of tax-exempt foundations or tax-exempt organizations dedicated, quote, to social welfare, unquote. This then led to basically the recognition of foundations nationally later on. But this also was the beginning of the legal recognition and the chartering of nonprofit organizations, which, are now there are thousands of them. And what was created was a vast policy-making power, a power within society with vast amounts of money behind it, completely independent of government. And this went down, and this progressed, through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And in terms of where we are today, after 1971, after the end of the Bretton Woods system, and then with the massive financial deregulation of the 1990s, the number and the role of foundations and nonprofits has just exploded, to the point that this is now an enormous spider web and complex of these organizations. And the modern day foundations, when Rockefeller founded the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913, he capitalized it with $100 million, which was a lot of money at that point. But today we're talking about foundations with not only tens, but hundreds of billions of dollars in capitalization. And if you look at the number of, the 50 largest foundations, or I think it might be less than 50, it might be 20. I don't have it right in front of me. But just the top foundations in the world have over $1 trillion in capitalization. And there are hundreds of other smaller foundations. So you're looking at an enormous financial power, independent of government. And it is these foundations who now set policy who are the makers of policy, in the United States and around the world. And they have many groups they work through. One is the United Nations. The United Nations is nothing at this point except an arm of the Fondo, as LaRouche talked about it, the oligarchical, trust system. That's all the United Nations is. It's an arm of the Fondo, an arm of the oligarchy. And then you have a lot of other organizations like this type. And they set policy on almost everything today. The entire green agenda, all of the COP conferences on, like the Paris Accords, all of this comes out of the foundations. Many, many other things. The whole global push, and particularly in the United States and Europe, but also elsewhere, for drug legalization. This all comes out of the foundations and the nonprofits that are spun off from the foundations. They create policy. And this is where the real power lies at this point. The script for much of what passes as legislation in Congress, the bills that go before Congress, are cribbed and scripted, from recommendations and studies and policy proposals coming out of the foundations and the nonprofits. That's how this thing runs at this point. Now, I will mention that there was one serious effort to get at this problem. This was during the mid to late 1950s and early 1960s. At that time, a congressman from Texas, Democrat, named Wright Patman, who is a very interesting guy. He's also a guy who I believe introduced legislation, I think almost every year he was in Congress, many, many years, he would introduce a bill in each new session of Congress to abolish the Federal Reserve. So he's a very interesting guy in a lot of ways. But from about beginning in the mid 50s, going all the way up to 1963, he held hearings investigating the role and the activities of foundations in the United States. And in 1962 and 63, his committee published 2 reports on this, in which they just, they just excoriated the role of the foundations, the power that they've accumulated. And in the final report, obviously the report itself is like hundreds and hundreds of pages long, but there is one sentence quote from Patman I want to give you, where he says in the final report, quote, "The economic life of our nation has become so intertwined with foundations that unless something is done about it, they will hold a dominant position in every phase of American life." A dominant position in every phase of American life. And he said that in 1963. And the situation today in regard to the foundations is far, far worse than it was in 1963. Now, I'm not going to go into everything that they proposed, but they did issue a series of proposals, and I'll give you a few of them. It's a fairly long list, but I'll give you a few. He said, the first step is to revoke the tax-exempt status of foundations. Second, place a 25-year limit on the lifespan of all foundations. 3, limit or even prohibit financial ties between foundations and corporations. 4, ban financial speculation by foundations. So that's just some of it. It's just some of what he proposed, none of which was ever adopted. There's a lot more that could be said there, but we have a lot to get through. So from foundations, I'm going to jump into the question of the nonprofits, because these are very much related. The foundations are far more powerful. This is where the real oligarchical power structure lies. Or I should say, because you could look at the banking and all that, but the policy making, oligarchical policy making, really flows from the foundations. And you could look at the nonprofits really more of as the foot soldiers. That may not be entirely correct, but it's one way of looking at them. But you have to realize how extensive this has become. Today, in the United States, there are almost 2 million tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, almost 2 million. Some of these are involved in legitimate activity. What you think of, if you think of the word charity, like giving food to the poor, making house visits to someone who has a terminal disease, or something like that, a charity, right? What used to be called charity. Some of them are involved in that kind of thing. There are worthy things that go on, but what has mushroomed and what has just expanded beyond all belief are the role of the nonprofits, both in two ways. One, in becoming the sort of foot soldiers and organizers for the policies of the oligarchy, and number two, their role in elections, really in all kinds of things, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But their direct political role, which has exploded in the last 10 to 20 years. And most people have no comprehension or no sense of how massive this has actually been. There's also the question of non-governmental organizations. These are organizations, some of them are registered in the United States as nonprofits, others aren't. They also, but non-governmental organizations are not restricted to the United States. They operate all over the world. And this really has its origin in the founding of the United Nations, where in 1945, in Chapter 10 of the UN Charter, they recognized the existence and gave official status to organizations that were not government or government sponsored, but were independent policy-making organizations, non-governmental organizations. And there are hundreds of thousands of these, literally. And they have become, again, massively active in the green agenda, in all kinds of things. And they've become particularly notorious in their role in various, what are called colored revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the revolution in Georgia, the Arab Spring, where they have been caught again and again and again, working with British intelligence, U.S. intelligence, the CIA, the U.S. State Department, in clandestine operations to overthrow governments. Very nasty stuff, real evil stuff. And these organizations all have seats at the United Nations, non-voting seats, but they're consultative. They're on all the committees. They're the ones who really, make policy because the UN has all these different agencies, like UNESCO and what have you, and this is where the non-government organizations have massive influence. But I'm not going to go into the NGOs any further. I will stick to the nonprofits in the United States. Now, look what happened in 2010 was that there was a Supreme Court ruling. It was a close ruling, 5-4. But this was in a case called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. And in that ruling, the Supreme Court overturned the 2002 Campaign Reform Act. And the 2002 Campaign Reform Act had restricted campaign contributions and put very tight regulations on campaign contributions and amounts that could be given and, transparency as to who was giving the money and all of this. And this was declared illegal by the Supreme Court in 2010. That was 13 years ago. And the effect of this, and we saw this, in particular, in the 2020 presidential election. We saw it last year in the 2022 congressional elections. The effect of this has been devastating because both in that ruling, the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, and then in subsequent court rulings, which flowed from that, what has been created is a situation in which political committees can now accept unlimited contributions, from individuals, from corporations, from trade unions, from NPOs. This also led into the creation of something called super PACs. And what has occurred is, if you just look at the last 8 years. So this is new, folks. This is not something that existed 20 or 30 years ago. But if you just look at the recent elections in the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, our electoral process has been overwhelmed and flooded with billions of dollars of what are called what's called dark money. Some people said, well, this will allow the trade unions to spend a lot of money, or people on the other side will say this will allow the corporations to spend a lot of money. But what has actually emerged is that this massive flow of dark money, which has entered our electoral process, has largely, overwhelmingly been channeled through nonprofit organizations and super PACs of wealthy donors, setting up these, these procedures. And, I could go into a lot of the details of this. 501c3 organizations, 501c4 organizations, and a lot of other things, but it gets a little bit too detailed for this kind of a presentation. So, but the idea is this whole thing has been perverted. I'll give you two examples. Right now, as some people might be aware, there is an effort to, there is an attack, as part of this effort to put Donald Trump in prison. There is a simultaneous attack on his attorneys, trying to essentially deny him a legal defense. And there are operations to try to disbar his attorneys, even indict his attorneys for being co-conspirators. A direct attack on his constitutional right to be represented. And this is very serious. Now, this entire effort is being run by something called the 65 Project. They're the ones funding this attack on Donald Trump's attorneys. Now, what's the 65 Project? It's a 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. Now, I will say one thing about these different classifications of nonprofits, because there's like about 20 different classifications of nonprofits, but the most restrictive one is 501c3. And 501c3, when it was originally created as a category, was supposed to be restricted completely to charitable activity. Other nonprofits could do some other things here and there, but 501c3 was initially supposed to be restricted to charitable activity. And as such, it was given preferential treatment. All contributions to the 501c3s are tax exempt. The 501c3s are, tax deductible. The 501c3s are exempt from themselves, are exempt from paying tax. They are given enormous incentives and whatever the proper word is, it's a preferential treatment in which they are given great leeway over their finances, over what they can do. And it's supposed to be restricted, or at least initially was supposed to be restricted to charitable organizations. But here you have this 65 Project, which is now trying to disbar and even imprison Donald Trump's attorneys. And, they have been granted 501c3 tax exempt status. Legally, they're a charity. And people who give to it can deduct the money on their taxes, and they don't have to pay income tax, right? And things of this sort. I'll give you another example, which is, during the 2022 congressional elections last year, a nonprofit named Accelerate Action received $5.5 million from George Soros. And they in turn then distributed that money through other nonprofits, the largest recipient being something called Gen Z for Change. And Gen Z for Change was an organization which was designed, and which is, it's doing it right now. Their activity was to hire people to make TikTok videos to influence young people politically, on, supporting transgenderism, supporting critical race theory, supporting green climate change policy, right? To make catchy, eye-catching TikTok videos, which then are pumped out to 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 25-year-olds. And they have 501c3 tax-exempt status, right? So taxpayer money is being used to finance all of this stuff. And it's all coming from the foundations. I will mention two organizations, since they're playing such a important role right now. One is an organization called Arabella Advisors, which was established in 2005. And they have become, they're not a nonprofit, they're a business, But what their business is to advise nonprofits, and to help them and to help nonprofits get established, file all the right papers, become registered as a 501c3 or 501c4 organization. They're essentially the enablers and advisors of nonprofits. They have dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds, I don't know, but an enormous number of clients of various nonprofits who they advise. And in the 2020 election, nonprofits, which Arabella advisors, the Arabella client base, spent $1.5 billion in the 2020 election to elect Joe Biden, right? One of their main clients, very tightly allied with the Democratic Party, is the 1630 Fund. And they receive huge contributions. They specialize in ballot initiatives, to legalize. I mean, they were one of the people who was one of the main financiers of the, various things, all kinds of things, all over the country, but also on candidates and ballot initiatives and things of that sort. So, this is an incredibly, intricate and vast complex at this point. It is an alternative policy-making apparatus, and they're spending, and billions of dollars flow through it. And if you're a congressman in Washington, and you're running for election, or you're a candidate to run for election, the way this thing works right now is that if you go along with the agenda of the foundations, the nonprofits, and the donors, the spigot gets turned on, and you get, millions and millions of dollars for your campaign. If you don't go along with it, the spigot gets shut off, and you get nothing. And what's likely to happen is that apparatus is then likely to spend millions of dollars to defeat you, either in the primary or the general election. Now, one point I do want to make, it's not the critical point, but it's important, I think, at least I think so, is that, people look at this and they say, Soros and this person and that person, and they think, well, it's all the Democratic Party. This is all, Arabella advisors, all this stuff. It's all the Democratic Party. It's all these left-wing socialists and what have you. And you would be making a big mistake if you think that, because the same thing is true in a slightly different way, but the same thing is true in terms of the Republican Party. I'm just going to mention a few things, and I have to wrap it up pretty soon. But look, on the right, you have the Koch family foundations. The founder of this was Fred Koch, who was also a founding member of the John Birch Society. He created the Cato Institute, the libertarian think tank, multi-billionaire. He had two sons, David Koch and Charles Koch, who were the famous Koch brothers. David Koch was the 11th richest person in the world. Charles Koch's the 20th richest person in the world. And they control a vast network of foundations. And then you have other people. Thomas Peterfee, I think it is, or Peterfee. He's the founder of Interactive Brokers, specializing on equity options. His net worth is $25 billion. He's the 57th richest person in the world. Paul Singer, he's a hedge fund manager. He works very closely with the Koch brothers. And he was actually involved in the effort to working through the Washington Beacon in the initial Russiagate operations against Donald Trump. Kenneth Griffin, another hedge fund manager, he's worth $35 billion. He's the 38th richest person in the world. Jan Koum, he was the co-founder of WhatsApp, the tech company. His net worth is $13.8 billion. Stanley Druckenmiller, he's a hedge fund manager. He worked for 12 years for George Soros. He is a major supporter of Chris Christie. Jeffrey Yass, he is his net worth is $28 billion. He's again a speculator and hedge fund investor. He was an early investor of TikTok. He's on the board of directors of the Cato Institute. He's the 48th richest person in the world. Clifford Asness, he's another hedge fund manager, AQR Capital Management. He's worth $2.6 billion. And I can go on and on and on. I mean, I can read a list of like 30 of these people. Now, why did I do that? Because they're all Republicans. That's why. This is the anti-Trump faction. When you think of rhinos, you think of Mitch McConnell, this, that, and the other person. They're the puppets. It's coming from this billionaire class. Remember what LaRouche said in the quote that I read to you? Among the gods of Olympus, they would quarrel, they would argue, they would cut each other's throats, right? But what they would all come together to agree upon is that jointly they would run the world. And that's how it works today. I mean, if you look at these people who want to, eliminate the minimum wage, who are for free trade, to send all of our industry overseas, who want to get rid of Social Security. This is the, free trade libertarian faction of Republican Party billionaires. And they have differences with their Democratic colleagues, but they all agree that the oligarchy should run the world. So, what you have to get at here, just in conclusion, is, you have to look at what our nation was intended to be versus this idea, which they say in their own words. Go back to what, Frederick Taylor says and these people in 1913. The Rockefeller Foundation will be coextensive with the human race. It will be immortal, right? You have to look at this and you have to ask yourself the question, what is constitutional government in the United States? What was it designed to be? It's government of the people on behalf of the people, and with a promise, with a pledge to create a better future for future generations of freedom, opportunity, invention, discovery, productivity, happiness, right? In which policy is made by people who are elected by the people themselves to carry out policies on behalf of the general welfare of all of the people. And what we are dealing with today, our electoral process is now overwhelmed by billions of dollars of money coming out of the foundations and out of the oligarchy. And it is their view that they are going to rule, as I said at the beginning, we have reached a point where the view from Mount Olympus is that these, things from the past, like the heritage of the Renaissance, of Renaissance culture, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and other things of this nature, that these things just have to go. That at this point, they have to be eradicated from human culture. And that is what we are seeing. That is the what we're confronted with. So what I'm particularly trying to do here is to try to get people to think about who the enemy really is. What is this? What is this thing? Which has been the mortal enemy of the American Republic since 1776, since 1789, the immortal enemy of humanity, going back to the gods of Olympus. Because that's the point that's the question, and that. And if you look at the crisis we're in today, it's not just about rich people making more money. Bill Gates doesn't need any more money. Maybe he would like more money. Some of these billionaires are giving their money away. It's not about just making more money. It's not about that at all. It's about imposing the oligarchical principle upon society and crushing all opposition to that, and corrupting the population, particularly the youth. All of this stuff targeting school children, teenagers, young adults, corrupting them. This is all coming out of the foundations and the nonprofits. That's where it's coming from. It's being financed. So I don't know. It's after 5 o'clock. I could talk on for hours, but let's stop and open it up for discussion.